Who was the worst heretical sect ever? For my money, it has to be the Borborites, a group of baby-eating Gnostics who are also known to consume a concoction of menstrual blood and semen in their sordid Eucharistic celebration. So yes, this is going to be weird and gross, so consider yourself warned. By the way, I'm not making this up. Heresiologists of the 4th and 5th centuries refer to these deviant group of Borborites who apparently existed in the East, in Armenia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and even made their way to Alexandria in Egypt. Their name, Borborite, comes from the Greek word borboros, which means dirt. So their group name could be translated as something like the dirty ones. Our main source about the Borborites is Epiphanius of Salamis, a 4th century heresiologist who, truth be told, is something of a mixed bag when it comes to reliability. Sometimes he's saying things about various groups that's well known and verifiable. Other times he appears to be repeating rumors and hearsay, and other times he trades in common tropes about deviant groups, and there are other times where you suspect he's just making stuff up. So I tend to put Epiphanius in the category of read but verify. Now, when it comes to the Borborites and Epiphanius' account, he's got something to say about them in his book called The Panarion, in book 26 of that. And this is what he says in that book about the Borborites. He says they go under different names. There's the Borborites, the Borborions, the Stratiotics, the Philbionites, the Zacchaeans, the Babylonites. In terms of tracing their origin, their history, he says they sprang from the Nicolaitans in Ephesus who are mentioned in Revelation chapter 2. In contrast, Theodoret of Mopsuestia sees them as a Valentinian variety of Gnosticism. Now, you've got to remember that ancient heresiologists always wanted to know the origin story of this group, how it all goes back to someone like Simon Magus or some group mentioned in the New Testament. If there was a group of Borborites, I think it's more likely that they were a variant of Valentinian Gnosticism than they came from the Nicolaitans, but that's neither here nor there for the moment. Epiphanius also says that their sacred books included the Gospel of Eve, the Gospel of Philip, Noria, which is about Noah's wife, the Apocalypse of Adam, the birth of Mary, and Questions of Mary. In fact, in one particular book called The Greater Questions of Mary, they claim that Jesus revealed things to Mary, who I think here is Mary Magdalene. Jesus took Mary up to a mountain, then praying, Jesus produced a woman from his side, then began to have sex with this woman in front of Mary, and then consumed his own emission. And Jesus purportedly said, "Thus we must do that we may live." And when Mary was alarmed, she fell to the ground. Jesus raised her up and said to her, "O thou of little faith, where didst thou doubt?" Yes, that's super weird, very sexual, a little bit gross, but remember, this sort of literature is meant to be taken symbolically, not literally. Epiphanius also says that the Borborites shared sexual partners and wives. They engaged in masturbation and homoerotic acts. They had a secret handshake with a kind of tickling of the palm. Epiphanius also reports that the Borborites had a common meal that was characterized by feasting and fornication. Now, when I read this, it immediately reminded me of what Clement of Alexandria said about a group called the Carpocratians. This is a group where they had some kind of meeting, then all the lamps were blown out, and it was kind of like, whatever goes is whatever goes. Clement said that he thought Jude was talking about this group or prophesying about them in his epistle. And we'll see here that Epiphanius, he also cites Jude's words about various groups who make a mockery of your love feasts. They're licentious. And so Epiphanius is also associating the Borborites with the sort of warnings you get about deviant, debauched groups from the Epistle of Jude. Epiphanius then reports, after this sort of orgy of unorthodox love and heresy, he says they then engage in a quasi-Eucharistic meal using the liquids produced by their fornication. And this is what he says. For after having made love with the passion of fornication, in addition to lift their blasphemy up to heaven, the woman and man receive the man's emission on their own hands, and they stand with their eyes raised heavenward, but the filth on their hands, and pray, we offer thee this gift, the body of Christ. And then they eat it, partaking of their own dirt, and say, this is the body of Christ. This is the Pascha, because of which our bodies suffer and are compelled to acknowledge the passion of Christ. And so with the woman's emission, when she happens to be having her period, they likewise take the unclean menstrual blood. They gather from her and eat it in common. And this, they say, is the blood of Christ. Now, that's Frank Williams' translation, which I was able to conveniently get from Roger Pierce's website. You've got to admit that's pretty gross. It's pretty gross. Epiphanius also says they prefer sex for enjoyment, not for procreation, and they don't like getting women pregnant. So they're kind of anti-natalist. They don't want to have babies and procreate, but they do want to enjoy sexual congress only for the pleasure. But Epiphanius says if they get a woman pregnant, he accuses them of aborting the infant and then as a group eating it with honey, pepper, and spices. You know what I mean? So this is basically abortion and cannibalism combined. This is pretty terrible, and the descriptions are pretty hard to read. He also says they reject fasting, which again is not unprecedented. If you go to the Gospel of Thomas, if you read verse 14, there the Thomasine Jesus also rejects things like fasting, prayer, and giving alms. So this is maybe something some groups did because they wanted to disassociate themselves with Judaism where they had fasting. Epiphanius also says that they accepted the Old Testament and the New Testament, but they regarded the speaker in the Old Testament as a bad god. Now, again, that's similar to other Christian groups like the Marcionites and the Valentinians who think that the God of the Old Testament is the bad guy or a wicked or a demiurge with a sense of justice but no compassion. Epiphanius also says they believe that the God of the Old Testament had the face of a donkey or a pig. Now, donkey-faced God actually is a thing. In fact, David Litwar has done a whole book on this, and he associates this sort of donkey god from Egypt with the origins of Gnosticism. And if you know anything about ancient Christian inscriptions, there's a thing called the Alexamenos Graffitio, where someone portrays Christ on the cross with the head of a donkey. So, yeah, donkey-faced God was an actual thing in antiquity, or maybe the pig-faced God is just making fun of the Jews for not eating pork. Epiphanius says they also believed in several heavens, each with its own archon or divine principle. They believed that Jesus was not born of Mary, but revealed through Mary. So there Jesus only appeared to have flesh. That would be an instance of what we call a docetic Christology, where Jesus only appears to have human form. He doesn't have it in reality. Now, there's an interesting point where Epiphanius claims that he even encountered members of this sect firsthand, probably in Alexandria, and that's where he learned about their doctrines. That's where he read some of their books, because he says some women from their own sect tried to seduce him, but he resisted them the same way Joseph resisted Potiphar's wife. He then says he reported them to the local bishop, and 80 members of their group were expelled from the city. And that is Epiphanius on the Borborites. What are we to make of all this? What are we to make of the Borborites? Was this a real group in antiquity with these strange, lurid rituals, a Eucharist of human semen and menstrual blood, abortion, cannibalism, strange views of Jesus and Mary? Is this real, or are people just making it up? Was there even a group of Borborites? Well, if you're inclined to skepticism, let me give you a quote from one scholar who specializes in the Far East, the religion of Mesopotamia, Iran, and Syria, Stephen Gero. This is what he says, and I found this very interesting. He says, even after all due allowance has been made for tendentious and distorted representation, it will appear that there is an element of factuality, a historical core in these reports. The Borborites survived tenaciously in Mesopotamia and elsewhere in the Christian East. And Gero goes on to say they were not just a fiction of the prurient imagination of celibate ecclesiastical heresy hunters. This group reacted to the admittedly prevailing ascetic ethos of fasting and sexual abstinence. In its stead, they preached and acted upon the view that salvation from the evil powers which rule the world can only be obtained through a delicate and full exercise of human sexual potentialities, specifically in a ritual form wherein the various sexual missions, male and female, played a central sacramental role, and in a manner which was aimed at the prevention of conception and birth. And Gero imagines the Borborites as a secret society that led a clandestine existence within other Christian groups, lay or monastic, similar to how the Valentinians did. The 2nd century Gnostic group, the Valentinians, they tried to be a group of spiritual elites within the church. And Gero is saying maybe these Borborites are similar. Maybe they were a secret society within churches of the East. And I have to point out, this group, the Borborites, they do get a mention in the law code of Justinian. Justinian was one of the first great Byzantine emperors of the 6th century, and the Borborites are mentioned beside Jews and Manichaeans whose legal testimony is invalid in court, particularly when pitched against that of an Orthodox believer. I've also got to say this, in the Nag Hammadi, there is a document called the Pistis Sophia, which is a 3rd or 4th century Gnostic text. And there's at one point in the Pistis Sophia where Thomas reports to Jesus this. He says, "We have heard that there are some on earth who take the male seed and the female monthly blood and make it into a lentil porridge and eat it." To which Jesus says, "Amen, I say. This sin is more heinous than all sins and iniquities. Such men will straightway be taken into the outer darkness and not cast back anew into the sphere, but they shall perish, be destroyed in the outer darkness in a region where there is neither pity nor light, but howling and grinding of teeth. And all the souls which shall be brought into the outer darkness will not be cast back anew, but will be destroyed and dissolved." So even the Pistis Sophia knows of a type of practice of combining, consuming semen and menstrual blood, and condemns it in some of the strongest language. Does this reference to the consumption of semen and menstrual blood mean we have an even earlier reference to the Borborites in the Pistis Sophia that goes back to the 2nd or 3rd century? I mean, does Pistis Sophia confirm the type of behaviors and practices that Epiphanius was warning about? Or was this kind of accusation just a common way of accusing deviants and defectors of all kinds of lurid rituals? That's why I'm a little bit skeptical. And I have to tell you, I'm not really sure there was a group of Borborites or a group that had these type of practices. Let me explain why. First of all, Epiphanius always needs to be taken with a grain of salt. He's not always clear what his sources are. Sometimes you think he's just rehashing rumors. Sometimes you think he's making stuff up. Now, he does have a lot of information that's very useful, but like I said, with Epiphanius, it's always read but verify. Here's the other thing we've got to remember. On the one hand, we've got to wean ourselves off a very Jewish and Christian worldview where our own intuitions and sensibilities about pollution and contamination have been shaped. Imagine a world independent of the Jewish and Christian tradition. Think of something pre-modern, something from a world that doesn't know the law of Moses, where there's different codes for pollution and impurity, where bodily fluids are considered a source of life, not a thing of uncleanness. And this is, I think, very possible in ancient fertility cults. So there may well be some truth here, because we hear of the allegation in Epiphanius. It's there also in the Pista Sophia. So maybe there is some Gnostic sect that's been influenced by traditions of ancient fertility cults that have millennia years old, and they're independent of the Jewish and Christian way of categorizing things clean and unclean. So we've got to be open-minded at one point. But, and here's the cause for skepticism, the accusation of a man consuming his own emission is a common trait of deviancy in the Greco-Roman world. Many Greco-Roman authors make this accusation that someone is so debauched, they are so beyond the pale, they are so licentious, they are so morally decrepit that they even consume their own emissions. In fact, we have a contemporary example of this. If you've seen the TV show Succession, there is one character who does accidentally consume his own emission. Hate to go into the details there, but this is a way of signaling moral decay, debauchery, and decadence. So that's why I'm a little bit skeptical. Also, did Epiphanius really meet the Borborites in Alexandria? If you read his account, you could get the impression that what really happened was he met some prostitutes with some strange religious views, not necessarily a Gnostic sect. Now, he claims he read their writings, but he never says he actually witnessed any of the rituals that he describes. So, like I said, you've always got to take Epiphanius with a grain of salt between the truth, the half-truth, and his own embellishment of what some deviant group does that make them so deviant. Also, the name Borborites might be a mistranslation of Barbello. Barbello was the name of a supreme aeon, a supreme kind of divine being in Gnostic theocosmogonies. And we know this from the Apocryphon of John. We know it also from Irenaeus, and there were groups who worshipped Barbello so much that they were known as Barbolites. So you have to wonder whether Barbolites, Borborites are simply variations of the same name. So look, perhaps there was a Gnostic or Manichaean group who worshipped an archon called Barbello, and maybe they were given over to licentious or unseemly behavior. Or maybe there was a group who drew on Gnostic mythology, and their beliefs and practices were, says Michael Williams, misunderstood, garbled, and even intentionally misrepresented by their critics as doctrines condoning licentiousness. Because, like I said before, you can get some really weird descriptions of Jesus and his disciples and Mary doing things, but these practices, these strange happenings like Jesus kissing Mary, are often meant to be taken symbolically. They have some sort of underlying allegorical reference. And maybe, as Michael Williams says, that there was a group of Borborites who simply had their views distorted by heresy hunters like Epiphanius. But in general, I think that this group and their behavior is made up because it's so stereotypical of the sexual deviancy attributed to religious sects, and the consuming human emissions is, I think, the quintessential example of moral deviancy. Again, if you go back to the Epistle of Jude, where it talks about those who pervert your love feasts, people who are libertine, who have sort of licentious behavior, who have brought moral corruption into the church, if you were to try imagine a group who does that kind of thing, that's where I think you get people called the Carpocratians or the Borborites. This is something that there may be a historical core, but it's perhaps become exaggerated and then taken on its own kind of fantastic tale of rumors and debauchery and licentiousness, or something along those lines is what I think happened. I also find it hard to believe that there was a group who called themselves the dirty ones. That seems pretty far-fetched for my mind. But hey, go read Epiphanius for yourself and let me know what you think in the comments below. What do you think of the Borborites? Were they real or were they not? Hey, thanks for watching this strange, bizarre, and a little unseemly episode of early Christian history, but I have to tell you, it is part of Christian history. So yeah, something we had to cover. If you like this episode, you can find similar content across the channel, where I do a lot of church history, I do a lot of biblical study stuff, even a little bit about Anglicanism and political theology, and sometimes even a little bit of humor thrown in. So yeah, enjoy that, and I hope to see you somewhere around the channel.